Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my annual Nonfiction November themed library haul. If you're one of the few who's unfamiliar, Nonfiction November is a month-long readathon hosted and created by Olive from a Book Olive that just encourages people to read more nonfiction. The general idea is just that if you read any nonfiction at all, then you are participating. Last night I finished reading Tanya Talaga's All Our Relations, which is one of the CBC Mathsy lectures series, so I've picked up a bunch of books in that series. That particular one is a look at the struggles, especially with regard to government inaction, but also suicide crises in Indigenous communities, primarily in Canada, but also in Brazil and in Norway, and to a certain extent in the United States and Finland are touched on as well in there. And I thought that format was really interesting. I think that was the first one of those that I've knowingly picked up, so I put a bunch more of those on hold. The first one of which is In Search of a Better World, a Human Rights Odyssey by Payam Akhavan. This is a look through basically human rights abuses in Iran, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and it sounds like a variety of other areas. The author is a law professor at McGill in Montreal and is a member of the International Court of Arbitration and has been involved with the UN in a number of conflict zones. So I think this is going to be an interesting overview of, or not overview, an interesting comparison of trends in ethnic cleansing, which sounds super depressing, but I think it'll be interesting. Jumping in a completely other direction, lest you think I only read really depressing topics about man's inhumanity to man, this is Hiking Canada's Great Divide Trail. This is like it says on the tin, it's a guide to the Great Divide, which is a trail that runs along the Continental Divide as it goes between Alberta and BC. If you wanted to go all the way across North America, you could. In the US, there's the Continental Divide Trail, which I believe links up with this, and you can search for through hikes of that on YouTube and waste a lot of time watching people hike. It's great fun. A friend of mine has been looking to plan some long distance hiking, so I've been doing a lot of hiking reading lately, and this is in line with that. Going back to depressing war stories, this is Svetlana Alekseievich's Zinky Boys, Soviet Voices from the Afghanistan War, which I'm sure is going to be horrific. This again is one of her oral histories where she did interviews with people but edits her own sections out so that you essentially get a series of monologues. So far this year I've read her oral history of Chernobyl and the aftermath, and of women serving in the Second World War in the Soviet forces, both of which were simultaneously depressing but very interesting. And this should be interesting as well. This is the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan lasted from the 70s through to the end of the 80s. And it's one of those things that I think we're all peripherally aware of, but I haven't read that much about it specifically, so I'm curious to see how this goes. Next up, I have another one that is from the CBC Massey Lectures series, Margaret McMillan's History's People, Personalities and the Past. She, of course, is the author of Paris 1919 and The War That Ended Peace. And I think this is her looking at specific people who had impacts on, I think, recent history. So some of them were Bismarck, William Lyon Mackenzie King, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Thatcher, Nixon, Samuel de Champlain. So not super recent, all of them. Yeah, so that should be interesting because I do enjoy her writing style and her sense of history. Let's switch to something less depressing again. This is Beyond Heaving Bosoms, the Smart Bitch's Guide to Romance Novels, which I think is hilarious. I've talked about this before. I'm a big fan of the cheesy covers on romance novels, so I think a cheesy cover on a book about romance novels is hilarious. I'm trying to remember who, I think it was Deboki from Okie Dokie Boki who recommended this. I am curious to get to it. And this book is, of everything that I have here, this is the most beat up. So people have clearly been enjoying this one. Next up, I have Billy Ray Belcourt's NDN Coping Mechanisms. This is a mixed format type and is mostly poetry, I think. And I think poetry is one of those forms of writing where it's difficult to define at any point whether it is fiction or nonfiction. The way this is blurbed, it kind of promises that it has a kind of truth to it, and truth is, after all, one of the prompts for this year's Nonfiction November, I think. So I'm gonna say that this counts, even though I know not everyone would count poetry. I did read one collection of poetry this year that had footnotes in it to botany journals, and so I think there's definitely an argument to make for a lot of poetry being nonfiction. Next up is Highballer by Greg Nolan. The subheading on this one is True Tales from a Tree Planting Life, which also has true in the title. This is, I believe, a memoir of the author's experience doing the tree planting jobs that I think a fair number of people in Canada do that over the summer when they're in university. They have these 4-month spans where they plant trees, and apparently you can make quite a lot of money doing that, relatively. And I have always been curious about that, so. And we've got photos as well. And I think this author started doing this as a teenager in the early 80s, so it's not necessarily the most current portrait of this kind of activity and this kind of job, culture, etc. But I am still curious to hear more about it. Next up, another one from the CBC Massey lecture series. This is Adrienne Clarkson's Belonging, The Paradox of Citizenship. And this is apparently a chronicle of citizenship as seen over the course of history. It is supposed to be going from ancient Greece through modern Canada. And it says, with particular emphasis on the Canadian model, including attitudes towards the First Nations circle as well as immigration policies. So that should be interesting. For non-Canadians, she was a TV personality, was Governor General in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think. Something completely different again. This is Move Your DNA by Katy Bowman, who is the nutritious movement person. I've seen a few of the big minimalist personalities on YouTube who are also into kind of natural movement stuff talk about her, and I was curious to see if this will be solid in terms of physiology or if will be a lot of woo-woo, because I feel like this kind of thing could go either way. Next up is a book that I've seen people talk about on BookTube for several years now. This is Ed Yong's I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us, and a Grander View of Life. The author is the science writer in residence at the Atlantic, and this is about defining microbes beyond germs, because I think that's what a lot of people associate with, even though that's an oversimplification. So I imagine this is going to be a general pop science type book. I have actually taken the ebook version of this out of the library probably 4 times, maybe 5 in the past couple of years, and I've never gotten around to reading it. It constantly returns itself before I get to it, so hopefully this time I've taken out the physical book, I will actually read this time. We'll see, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Next up is a book that, if you follow me on Instagram, I talked about this book a while ago. I didn't get around to finishing it before it was due back, and I had to send it back to the library unfinished, so I'm looking forward to reading the second half of it now. This is How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship by Ece Temelkuran, who's a novelist in addition to being an essayist. This book is primarily about politics in Turkey, but it also has a lot to say about things that are happening in the US, the UK, and Brazil, I think. The state of the world, in which many of us from countries where we, elect centrists who don't really stand for anything, and we pat ourselves on the back and say, well, at least we didn't elect a fascist like some of our neighbors, which is not necessarily the best attitude to have. But anyway, I found the first half of this to be really interesting, and I'm looking forward to finishing this. Next up is a book that is not what I thought it was when I picked it up off the shelf at the library, and this is Queer Eye. Love Yourself, Love Your Life. I didn't see the subheading when I picked this up, and I assumed that this was going to be before and after photos of, I hoped, the houses of people that they make over on the show. And that's not what this is. This is more of a self-help / coffee table book with lots of artsy photos and, I don't want to say, not self-congratulatory, and self-affirmation type quotes. So it's probably cheesier than what I actually wanted. And if it had been the before and after photos, I could have called this part of the design prompt. But it's not, but I will flip through it, because who knows, maybe it'll be entertaining. And every now and then I do like some inspirational cheese, so we'll see. And finally, I have another coffee table book, and that is Lonely Planet's Epic Hikes of the World. This is, again, back to the hiking thing that my friend and I are planning. because we've been debating about particular trails, some in Eastern North America and some in Central Asia. We haven't worked out exactly which one we want to go to. And this is exactly what it says on the cover. Shows you hiking trails everywhere. It is a good split of information and photos. I think with this kind of book, you never know. It could go a little too far one way or the other, but I'm quite enjoying this, and it is also very pretty. All right, so those are the physical books that I have out of the library right now that fit the Nonfiction November theme. If you have read any of these, I would love to hear what you thought of them, and if they inspired you to read anything else related. If you can think of any good pairings for these, I'd love to hear more about that too, in case any of these end up being particularly inspiring, because that is always my hope with this kind of thing. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.